I would like to welcome everyone today to the School of Interactive Arts and Technologies speaker series, which has been programmed by graduate students in our program through our graduate research colloquium. So welcome everybody. It is great to see you here today. My name is Kate Hennessy. I'm a professor here at the School of Interactive Arts and Technology, and I've been really happy to work with students this to program this colloquium. We're really thrilled today to have Cecily Morrison from Microsoft Research joining us. And in just a moment, we'll invite Priscilla Lowe to introduce Cecily more fully. But before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that here at Simon Fraser University, we are gathering on the unceded ancestral traditional territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. And in Simon Fraser University, Surrey, we are on the unceded ancestral traditional territory of the Katzie, Kwantlen, Coquitlam, Kwajkwat, Tawasan, and numerous Stolo nations. With that in mind, I will now hand things over to Priscilla Lowe, who will introduce our speaker today. Thank you, Priscilla.
Yeah, thank you, Kate and Reese, for organizing this research colloquium, and thank you all for attending today. I'm Priscilla, a student from the Tangible Embodied Child-Computer Interaction Lab at SIAT, and it's a great pleasure for me to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Cecily Morrison. Cecily is a Principal Research Manager in the Future of Work community at Microsoft Research in Cambridge, England, so we're very grateful that she agreed to do this talk despite the 8-hour time difference. She was awarded an MBE for Inclusive Design on the Queen's Birthday Honors List in 2020, and her research focuses on empowering applications of artificial intelligence for people who are blind or have low vision, and building innovative technologies to build a future of inclusion. Most recently, she is working on the People Lens project, which uses AI to support social interactions between children who are blind and their peers, and Find My Things, using computer vision to help people with visual impairments find personal objects. Today, she will discuss the design and commercialization process for CodeJumper, an inclusive physical programming language that teaches basic programming to children, regardless of visual ability. As designers, developers, and researchers, we can all learn from this project how we can incorporate inclusive and accessible design practices and create impactful products that help people do things they couldn't do before. Please give a warm welcome to Dr. Cecily Morrison.
Thank you very much. Where are we? So it's quite funny. I was just asking before we start about the weather over there, and you've got better weather over there than we've got over here. So we're not connecting on the weather at this moment, but it's great to be connecting around, I think, a real passion around the rich design of bringing design and technology traditions together. And while I can't see you as an audience, and I don't know many of you, I'm going to hazard a bet that, like me, there are many of you in this audience who want to build technologies that do good in the world. But there's this real moment of, how do we choose that right challenge? How do we design something that can be absorbed into the ecosystem that's already there? And then how do we make that final step from fantastic research prototype to impactful product? So in this talk, I will reflect on the process of designing and commercializing CodeJumper, which is a physical programming language for teaching the basics of programming to children ages 7 to 11, regardless of the level of vision, and try and dive into some of these questions on the end based on a very practical example. To get us going, I'm going to show you a video. You can see in CodeJumper how children or young people connect pods, which are statements in their program. They adjust the dials, which are the parameters of those statements, to create programs that produce stories, music, poetry, or really any kind of auditory creation. Children can then physically follow or trace their program as it executes to develop their understanding of how programs are composed together. So I'm going to ask who's ever doing slides to move us on to slide 2 and play the video, please.
Project Arena is a physical programming language that allows children ages 7 to 11 who are blind or low vision to access the computing curriculum.
Students learn, if I take this device and plug it into this device and plug it into the hub, that creates a loop. It could be music, so they may be able to loop a couple notes together. they can create a repeat, they can add additional notes. The possibilities are endless.
The huge benefit of Torino is it's a physical environment. The students can actually touch and manipulate the different elements that make up the programming environment.
Each pod is a statement in your program. It's one line of code. And you then put those pods together to create those lines of code in your program. Many of these kids come in with a whole set of skills ripe for computing.
Yeah.
And we just need to give them the tools that allow them to grow that talent.
Programming is an ideal potential job opportunity for visually impaired people. They actually make up approximately 1% of the programming community worldwide.
It's either the top one or the bottom one.
It's the bottom one you need to change.
It's an environment that will work for any student that is a tactile learner. Because it's accessible, it allows you to immediately engage with the concepts of programming. It allows you to immediately create programs that work.
If this one was on 8 and that was on 1, this one would play because the number is higher.
Particularly in this case, where there's quite a specialized market, we needed to partner with someone who really understood that market and really understood how we would get a quite advanced technology into the hands of the kids that it would be most impactful for. APH know how to do that.
Microsoft handed us this project name of Torino, and we decided on the name Code Jumper. And they said, take all this research and time and energy and money we've spent and help us get this into the hands of students and be a partner with us.
Our hope is that we inspire all blind and low vision children to code regardless of where they are.
I think we only need 2 because then the next one there's more than 1 note.
Yes.
And then we put a pause in between.
Yes, that's right.
There's been lots of light bulb moments where they've suddenly understood a concept, where they've been able to track through the program physically as it's running. So they've been really enthused about Project Torino. And as a teacher, that's what you want to see in your students. You want to see that level of enthusiasm to learn more.
It is an active, hands-on learning, hitting at those most concrete and operational levels for a student. And I think it's just the beginning of what's to come for this field.
Great. If you could take us to the next slide. There we go. Thanks. So going into a bit more detail, each pod is a statement in the program. We have different kinds of pods. We have play pods, rest pods, loops, selections. And these can all be connected to create a flow of program, which starts at the hub, which it's in the middle of this image. It's the largest pod. And we've got 3 threads coming off that, and they really are threads in the like, and they'll play at the same time. For those of you who are more used to block-based code, you can see the equivalent block-based code on the right-hand side. The pods then have dials on them, which allow us to change the parameter values of each statement. For example, the number of times you want to loop or the value that each play pod is going to play. But these can also be changed programmatically through the insertion of plugs into the dials. So for example, I can use a random plug to get a random sound to play from any one of these pods. Now, these are 2 core concept program flows and parametric values. But then these are then supported by a full curriculum that has been matched against the US and the UK computing curriculum for this age group, elementary school or primary school that you might call it. We'll go to the next slide, please. So this project of Code Jumper started as Project Torino, and I'm going to take you a little bit onto a fairly detailed journey of the different stages that we went to as a way of thinking about and reflecting upon this journey and those 3 questions I put forward at the beginning. If we can go to the next slide, please. So with the birth of our first son, who is blind, my husband and I dove into the world of blindness. We were, took it as it was and said, right, let's get on with this. Let's figure out how this works. And I have to admit, one of the things that we were most surprised by, and I have to admit slightly horrified by, was that we realized that how much of the technology that we would have in our household was technology of the past. So what you see on that slide is a smart Perkins braille. Pretty much every child in the Western world will use a Perkins braille at some point. And we had this in our house from the time our son was 2 or 3 years old, and we would play with it and draw with it. And one time a family came over, they had a son who was 6, and he said, oh, what's that? And I said, oh, that's Ronan's braille. And So what do you do with a braille learner? I said, well, that's how Ronan writes. That's how he communicates. And his mom tried to add to that and said, oh, well, it's like a typewriter for blind people. So the son turned to the mother and said, what's a typewriter? And I was like, well, yeah, this was definitely technology of the past. His generation was kind of no idea about the kinds of technologies he's going to use, the size of them, the bulk of them. They're really separators out rather than ways of inclusion into a mainstream world. If we can go to the next slide, please. There we go. So this really inspired us to want to engage the blind community or children in the blind community to learn the skills to imagine their own digital future. So in this picture, we've got two young children who are making a device that turns light into sound. This was the first step in helping them to imagine how this could be a core of a technology that would be personally useful to them. That's what they were learning about the design process. So through this process, we got to fashionable hats that control the lighting conditions, but we also got to robots that run around imaginary 100-room castles, determining whether they have windows or not. But all in all, we got kids imagining technologies of the future, and very specifically, their future. So if we go to the next slide, please. We soon discovered that this workshop was not the end of this story. Soon after, parents came back to us and told us that their child wanted to build their design. They wanted to code. Like, great, children want to code. But how can we help these kids who are blind and low vision code? Well, that really stumped us, because at the time, which I think this was 2014, 15, the block-based languages were not accessible at all. Trying to use a screen reader on a conventional program language, we discovered requires a substantial amount of understanding of assistive technology and a lot of perseverance. And I think the best way to really connect the experience of these kids, as we saw it, was try to imagine writing code when you can only see one line of code at a time and there's no syntax whatsoever, as if you're in sort of Notepad. Most adults who are proficient in code would really struggle. But this put our 8 and 9-year-olds completely to tears, because they're bright kids. They know they were good at maths. They know they're good at this, and they just couldn't get their heads around what were all these random lines of code and how did they relate. The next slide, please. So this brought us to a we knew we needed to make something physical. Physical things for blind kids is really the only way for them to get an overview of what's going on. So over lunch one day with one of my Hardweek colleagues, Nick Villar, who's pictured in this slide here, I asked, what was on the market that we could use to prototype things? And he said, well, it wasn't really anything, but it wouldn't be too hard to make something, given that they had been trying to solve a lot of these hardware challenges in their sort of connected play research strands. Well, this was never a project that was meant to be our key research projects. Fairly soon after, Project Torino, which is the code name that would become Code Jumper, was born. And that was about 2016. So we go to the next slide, please. So here we were ready to start. And I want to talk a little bit about how we use a young design team to get to our first prototype. So we go to the next slide, please. So we took this problem in a very simple way. We thought, right, there are blocks on a screen. Let's make them tactile blocks on a table. Seems pretty obvious. And then you can see in the pictures here, we've got some 3D printed blocks on the left that we're playing around with. They're nicely lined up against the box. On the right-hand side, we've got some, I think these were called Cubetto at the time. They're magnetic blocks that went together. Lots of fun, but didn't do very well in making in code. And through this process, we learned actually really rather quickly, through the young design of 4 blind and low vision children we worked with, that blocks were not a very good idea. Indeed, they get lined up, they get abandoned, they're not exciting to the hands, they're not exciting to engage with. Magnets are even worse. It's always a great idea to connect stuff, except if you're blind, because as soon as you pick it up, it falls apart. You can't hand it to someone. You can't get a full 3-dimensional experience of stuff. If we go to the next slide, please. So the young design team worked with us over a period of months to really craft shapes that fit in the hands. And quite quickly, they guided us to pods that immediately produced response. People didn't just want to touch things. It wasn't about getting tactile information. It was engaging their full hands and sensory systems with this system. The next slide, please. And so that, bringing this whole tactile experience to bear, we move from this non-responsive block metaphor to a live bead metaphor. And you can see some of the initial sketches we were doing when we were thinking about what could this programming language look like? And we realized that what we could do here was create an experience that could excite the hands of all children. Blind children need their hands excited, but actually all children like to engage with their hands at this age. Next slide, please. So we designed the first version of Torino in our hardware labs, which you can see on screen here. It's got a square hub in the middle, which allows us to play out the sound is created. And then it's got the spherical and circular or different kinds of egg-shaped pods. These were built in our own hardware labs with some of the wonderful interns and postdocs doing an awful lot of hand soldering of these kits. And this was a great start. We learned a huge amount from this early prototype that really challenged our thinking into what it is we were trying to do. I'm going to share some of those insights before we go on to where we went from here. So we go to the next slide, please. One of the first things we realized was how important it is to follow a program. Indeed, some of the few published research literature in computer science learning at the time, which has now, of course, changed many years later, was that students who understand how their code works are much more likely to succeed in the later stages of computer science. And this then became a core tenet to our design. So if you could play the video, please.
That was the rest. That's the end. There's one here.
That was the last thing, right?
So it goes dim dim dim, pause, dim dim dim, dim dim dim, dim.
So as we see in this video, we also learned a couple of other really important things. If you're going to be touching and engaging and using your hands on a program, small isn't necessarily better. We were always trying to make things smaller. We thought it's more convenient to carry around. You can do more of them. But actually what we learned is that things that are large fit in the hands. They can be shared with other people. And these are two, again, design tenets that became critical to the further iterations of this design. If we can go to the next slide, please. And then sort of following this argument of wanting to make things workable in the hands, we resisted, I think, despite our nature, as many of us being computer scientists, to want to make the language continually more expressive. We realized that its physicality and the limitations of that physicality was actually its biggest asset. For example, it made computational problems the right size for young people, constraining them to engage directly with constraints such as efficiency. So in this video, we're going to see a girl who's trying to create a program to play jingle bells, but she doesn't have enough beats. If we can play the video, please.
Jingle.
Oh dear.
Oh.
That's not going to work.
There needs to be some pauses in here.
Pauses? Think about the words. Jingle bells. Jingle bells.
Just two beats with that need to say jingle.
Right, okay. But you haven't got enough for that, have you?
No.
So you're going to have to think a bit more efficiently. How can you make jingle happen 3 times if you haven't got enough beats?
Oh, I got it. I got it.
She's got it, she's got it.
So what we see here is she's being forced to deal with the fact that she can't just add more and more commands. She has to really think about the structure of her program, and she's adding a loop to make jingle happen 3 times. So we decided that for the most part, we didn't really want to expand the capabilities of the language. We didn't want to make it bigger. Actually, its smallness or its compactness was what was an advantage here. But we did decide that we needed to solve the problem of variables, as they were really key to the lower stage computer curriculums. So that was one thing we decided to add in another version. If we go to the next slide, please. We also had one other really major problem with this first prototype, which is that it could never be produced at scale. We would need to take all that we learned and to start again to work out a productionable set if we wanted to do something that would go beyond research to have real world impact. So the image you see there is some of the soldering and wires that was going on to actually make these things happen. And it was an incredibly tedious and long process. Next slide, please. So that took us on a journey to say, right, we need to make a manufacturable Torino. We know this, kids are excited about it, we can see they're learning, but if we want to get to impact, we need to actually completely redesign this. And next slide, please. We brought designers, hardware engineers, accessibility experts together to really rework the designs and really try and hold on to all of those learnings and sort of key design elements, but really work with the potential opportunities of manufacturable hardware. Next slide, please. So one of the keys to a manufacturable design was having a PCB that could be used in all the different pods, something that would be easy and be able to be assembled either semi by machine or in a very repetitive way that didn't require hand soldering, for example. We also knew that to do that, we were going to need all of the PCBs to be fairly similar, and that we need to translate the feel of the beads into something that could be flatter, but still distinct to the hands. Similarly, we had some great tactile mechanisms of clickers and rotational things. The kids love these, but we just couldn't make these at scale. So we needed dials or a mechanism that would be still fun for the hands, but that could be more consistent across the boards. So instead, we put a lot of effort into the thought about texture and color and sort of thinking about these tactual and visual distinctions that we saw were key in the beginning, but that could still have enough similarity to be manufacturable. We also took advantage of this redesign to add variables. So you can see perhaps one here under the children's hands. That's a plug that goes directly into modify the parameters, which I have to say is a very neat piece of hardware engineering for those of you who might be hardware people in the audience. Next slide, please. So what you can see is when we take off those plastic shells, we've got what looks like almost exactly the same double layered PCBs with these sort of rotational dials that can be placed in different places to give the beads a distinct feel. Go to the next slide, please. Just to give you the sense of the scale and the size of making this work, and this was really trying to keep it as compact as possible. We had 45 injected molded part designs. We had 5 circuit board designs assembled into 25 different configurations. We had 3 custom cable designs, 105 individual plastic parts, and 48 individual circuit boards per kit. So I have to say, I was extremely glad that our research colleagues were veterans of hardware production process in China. That was not my expertise, and it was a completely new learning space for me. But we did achieve in this something that was manufacturable, but something that maintained a lot of the key design principles that we saw were needed as we were working with the children. If we go to the next slide, please. So here we are. We've gotten from a workshop that gave us an idea that we should be doing something in this space through to, actually there are 3 versions. I don't know if you caught that. There were 3 versions in total to get to manufacture. But that in itself wasn't an end. It wasn't enough just to get a product there. We knew that to really bring this into the community, we were going to have to show that this worked. And that was the Torino beta trials. If we go to the next slide, please. These kits, and we'll talk about costs in a moment, it's not easy to get them onto the market at their cost. So we knew we were really going to have to show that teachers could go away, take the kits, take the curriculum, and use it on their own accord for a number of months with good outcomes for this to be really viable as an impactful product. So we carried out a fairly wide-scale evaluation across the UK with 75 children, 30 teachers, and 24 local authorities. And I'm not going to go too much into the details. There are papers that capture those all rather well. But I want to reflect on some of the key design principles and learnings that we had from that. If we go to the next slide, please. So first, what's critical to this large-scale trial was teaching resources. Indeed, we created a full 21-lesson curriculum. Now, as a tech researcher, that's generally not something I see within my DNA. It's not my job to create. My job is to create technology. But more and more, and I think some of the other things like the people lens that we've done the same thing, that we can see that if we're going to get these things out in the world, it's not enough to create the technology, because the technology in itself isn't a world changer. It's the technology plus the learning that enables that's going to be impactful. So we've really stretched ourselves to say we really have to do this end to end if we want to make this impactful. But we also know that when we build out these new technologies, we've spent a lot of time thinking about how they relate to education, how they relate to the learning that's going on underneath. And that might not be very obvious to primary school teachers in any country. Most of them will have never coded, or maybe at best use block coded. So they won't know about things like you need to trace your code. They won't understand what you can do with a small amount of beads to really push on computational concepts. So to embody a lot of that design thinking, we also knew that the curriculum was going to get the teachers there with us, rather than having them use it in a way that wasn't going to get to the outcomes that we knew we could get to. If we go to the next slide, please. We also really confirmed the need for a low floor and high ceiling. So anyone who's worked in educational technology, this is, I think, from either from Mitchell Resnick or Seymour Papert, when they started doing Scratch, this was one of their key goals. Well, this is even more important in the disability space, because the differences between children are absolutely vast. We had some students who had their teachers raved at what an incredible educational experience they got, but they never got creating a sequence more than 3 beads long, but it was the best education that child had ever had. And then we had other children who were making, embedded loops or nested loops in very complex, and sending us new programs and really pushing the boundaries of how they could use variables and trying to really trick some of the hardware fixes around the ordering that variables play out, for example. So we really had the full spectrum. If we go to the next slide, please. Thank you. And I think it's just a reminder that we need to remind ourselves, and almost everybody that we work with, that the disability community, it's easy to think of them as relatively homogenous because they have a label. They are blind, they are autistic, and so forth. But this is really very far from the truth. In fact, I think these are some of the most diverse communities that you could come across. And what we found was particularly interesting. We tried to be very relaxed by research standards in what we insisted on the data, the ways that children used it, and on the data that was collected, in order to encompass this really wide variety of things. And in doing so, we got a lot of children with additional disabilities. And a general figure, at least from the UK, is about 50% of children who have a visual impairment will have an additional disability. So we found that this included children with physical disabilities, like in this image, but also quite a lot of children with neurodivergence of some kind. And one of my favorite anecdotes from one of the teachers that worked with Project Torino or Code Jumper was that they had a child on the spectrum who was blind, and that the number one thing that he had learned that had absolutely transformed his life was the debugging process. And this was helping him cope and solve with problems that had nothing to do with programming. So the teacher said, well, it was great to learn code, but this has been the real thing that's changed this child's life. We go to the next slide, please. And in fact, actually, one of the things that we learned was that the most valuable role that our products seem to bring, or our technology seemed to bring to these young people, was not teaching programming at all. It was enabling children with different visual abilities to play together. So the blind boy that you see here on the right was able to play for the first time ever with a friend alone without sighted support. He was 11 years old at that time. That was the first time he'd been one-to-one with another child without the need for somebody else there, because finally they had a toy that they could play with that didn't require either to be boring to the sighted child or inaccessible to the blind child. Do you want to play, if you can play this video, please?
Play E5 for a half a beat. End loop. Play A5 for a half a beat. Play G5 for a quarter beat. Play D5 for 1 beat. Loop 3 times. Play D5 for a half a beat. End loop. Play F5 for a half a beat. Play E5 for a quarter beat. Play C5 for 1 beat. End thread.
So here what you've just seen is a sighted and blind child working together on their code. If we had a slightly longer video, you would see them celebrating as they finally solve this quite complex problem. But this was not unique with the teachers that we work with. The vast majority of them were using coding as a way to support social interaction with friends. I have to admit, personally, we saw the same thing with our own son, who is now 10. So last year when he was 9, it was the first time he had also been able to play on his own with another child. He was 9, so better than 11, but it's still a major, major challenge for these kids. Now, this was an interesting and slightly perplexing thing to think about as a researcher, because I was incredibly proud that we had accidentally accomplished something that was so impactful for these kids. But I was also realized that it's quite difficult to change our mantra from talking about, we're here to talk about code and help kids code, to actually, we're here to help kids make new friends. And finally, somehow governments are very happy to pay for the first one and not so much to the second, even if the second one is far more important to the child and their social and educational development. So that brings us on to our last slide. We changed slides, which was, all right, so we built this, we've tested it out, but we've got this advanced research prototype, we've got fantastic results from the study. Kids really get on with it, whether it's to learn or just to socialize, but what now? So we knew that we needed someone close to the community to turn this into a product. We explored a whole range of potential partners, but we landed with the American Printing House for the Blind. They are a nonprofit educational institution that develop tactile and adapted materials for blind and low vision students. They're semi-funded by the US government. They do a great job in the US, but their products are only starting to get further afield than that. So we knew that they were set up to engage the education community. They are at the center of the blind education community in the US. We also knew they had experience with manufacture process, because a lot of blind things are things you touch, they're things you have to manufacture. Although they'd never done that in China, which was an interesting experience for us in helping them with that. And so we ended up partnering with them, and we licensed them the IP in return for a certain level of sales distributions across a wide set of geographies, which is another interesting conversation about how that process can go, that we can go into later. So that brings us to the end of this journey. And now I'd like to spend the next sort of 15 minutes or so going in on sort of some of the reflections, some of the ways things we should be thinking about when we're creating our own technologies, whether they're for the disability community or some other specific community. But before I do that, I'm going to pause for questions, and we can go to the next slide as people, if there are any burning questions to answer now.
Cecily, I'm not seeing any questions in the chat just yet.
Right. We'll keep going then, because there'll be lots of time for discussion at the end. So if we go to the next slide, please. Just to me, there, yeah, great. So I think if I reflect back on this project, I think the most important thing that made it successful, and now we've commercialized several technologies for the blind and low vision community, but to me, this is the most successful one, and that's why I'm sharing this one. And because we really got it right in terms of finding the right challenge. And I think this is the part that takes a long time, and people really want to jump to, well, I need to get and do something. So where am I going to start? That's often the case. But I think thinking really deeply about what is that right challenge is worth the time and the effort. And it's also been my experience that the right problems to solve don't necessarily come by sitting down and thinking about them actually, but rather exposing oneself to the places and the communities that will be the beneficiaries of this technology. Of course, we have many user research methods, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, but these only get us so far. I think the technologies that land the best are the ones where we're really responding to a need in a community, and we have a much deeper understanding of that community than a lot of user research methods can offer us. Now, of course, there are alternative ways to do this. We don't necessarily have to be the expert in that community. We can hire in people from various communities. Certainly in our team, we brought in multiple colleagues who are blind or have other disabilities to generate and steward ideas that we as a team can then support them to bring to their communities. But the other point I might just note is that many of us are part of communities that we can connect with the research. And reflecting on my own experience, early in my career, I wanted to stay as far away from all things blind as possible. You know, I had lots of blindness at home. I loved it. We were deep into it, but I really wanted something different at work, just to have a balance in my own life. But I started to realize over this now 10-year journey that I've been on in these technologies that there's something incredibly valuable about one's own lived experience. And it's something that it's very hard for other people to replace, no matter how dedicated they are. And for those of you out there who have a lived experience that can be really valuable, I encourage you, as difficult as it can be navigating your professional circumstances, to bring that lived experience in as an asset rather than throwing it out, because no one else is going to do it as well as somebody from the community who's going to be benefiting and receiving in using these technologies. If we go to the next slide, please. I also think part of the success of CodeJumper was the number of times we really let the design challenge our preconceived ideas. Because we didn't need to do this as a research project that would fit into the normal veins of Microsoft expectations, we were doing this as a side project. We were really free to go with the design. And that, to me, brought a lot of success to the project that we might not have otherwise had. Now, blocks on a table should equal blocks on a table. Terrible idea, but I can't tell you how many people I've met since then who think, great, yeah, of course, blocks on a screen, blocks on a table, right? And going through this process, you start to realize why that's not such a great idea. And I think in some ways, that's the beauty and the power of inclusive design, is to really push beyond one's own possible imagination. We have to bring in constraints that we're not familiar with. And this is also true, I find, that even if you can get there with inclusive design, you bring yourself there, you bring your team there, it can also be true that most of us will have some kind of feedback loops, whether it's other students, whether it's faculty, whether it's the general public. And we find that within that feedback loop, they can take you away from trying to push beyond the possible imaginations, because everybody wants to bring the design closer to their own perspective in order to understand it. But that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to then come closer to the right design for the group that you're designing for. And I have to say, one of the things I've always found incredibly ironic is that CodeJumper, the only people who could never use CodeJumper were professional programmers. They couldn't use it, they didn't like it, they didn't understand it. They thought it was terrible. And for them, it was, but it's not for them. We have to constantly be reminding ourselves when we're having these feedback loops and conversations, are people drawing us towards their own vision rather than towards the needs of the community we're working? To the next slide, please. I think one of the biggest challenges that we often don't talk about is getting the scoping of the technology right. If you wanted to go out into the world and be impactful, it needs to be broad enough to meet the needs of enough people in that community to really be commercializable. Often, many of the disability communities or communities of marginalization are often low incidence or lower incidence, so that you need to reach a larger number of them. But you also need to not go the other side of making it so general that the product's not really useful to anyone. And I think this balance is particularly hard in the disability community. And I think it's one of the most biggest unseen impacts of why many great research prototypes don't succeed, because they haven't got the scoping right that's going to work out in the real world. It's great for research, but it's not scoped to fit into the real world. And I would encourage people to think about this, because you put so much effort into creating those great prototypes. You test them, you know they're fantastic. But if you've got that wrong at the beginning, it's really hard to fix when you want to make that final stage to impact. To the next slide, please. I think, and this is part of scoping, but a different angle on it, is the disability ecosystem. And if you're working in a different area, it's the ecosystem of which your technology is going in. How are these technologies funded? How do they come to be owned and used by people? So when we were designing CodeJumper, we had a fairly deep knowledge of how technologies got distributed in the educational system. We knew which ones parents could demand. We knew which ones the Department of Education would automatically support. We knew which ones the education system was going to engage with. We also had several explorations of different models of getting technologies to people as products through tactile libraries. And these things were really key in shaping a lot of the decisions, the less visible design decisions that we made to try and make sure that it would be possible to make this final jump. One thing we didn't succeed in was that I really wanted to bring CodeJumper into mainstream usage in production, because I knew if we could do that, because of the way hardware is set up, we could drop the price to a reasonable level. And although we have achieved this on a small scale, we've shown that it works really well in mainstream classrooms. The ecosystem still blocks this potential. We still have a very divided ecosystem between accessibility providers and mainstream providers. And the ability to move between those is getting a little bit better, but it's still highly problematic. And each of those different providers bring very different expectations into what a technology should be, how it should be brought to people, and with it even very basic but very important distinctions like what's the margin on top of that technology? Is it 5% like we'd have in the mainstream, or is it 15 to 20% like you have in an accessibility company? So really big differences that really impact this ability to go mainstream, and then as a result the ability to bring the price down so it benefits the actual community that we want to serve. And so we found generally a lack of motivation of companies to sell low volume, to engage in different business models. And as a result, although we knew it was possible, we knew it would be a good thing, we were never able to get the ecosystem to a point where we could mainstream the technology and bring the price down to what I think we could have done if we could up the volume of sales. And to the final one. Yep. A research prototype, in my mind, it's just not done. And I think there's a lot of things to consider besides the design to have impact. What are the learning resources? What's the business model? What are the government structures or incentives that you're working in? And this could go on. I've mentioned a couple of them in these reflections. But I would really encourage people to start including these insights and finding them out early on in their design process, because you'll never get from great research prototype to societal impact if you can't engage with and understand and address the design to these kinds of constraints. And I want to add to this that I think there's a really under-discussed and very tricky and gnarly question about how we engage and imagine with disability communities without letting them down. I think, and I've experienced this personally on the other side with my other hat on, it can be really hard to take. Well, I know it's really hard if you're a student or even a professor in a university to take a prototype to product. The kind of resourcing and time and is really tricky to do. But on the other hand, it's equally problematic for a family who tries something. They put their all into it, they adopt it, and then you say, well, actually, I'm glad you love it, but you can't have it. And we've seen a lot, and I'm seeing more and more in the last 10 years, is they're becoming more and more prototypes and more research done, particularly with the blind community, one of the highly researched disability communities, that we're starting to see very much more cursory engagement from our people that we use our tests with, because they just don't want to shift their ways of working to adopt a new technology, put all that effort in to start to see their world in a different way with different set of strategies, and then be told, well, I'm sorry, but the product won't come to market, or even worse, the product comes to market and it's taken off 3 or 4 years later. So I think we should be engaging in this really challenging discussion of how can we engage and imagine with them without really letting these communities down. And we'll go to our final slide, which is just thank you to the team who made this project a success, which we had very little minimal institutional support, but a lot of people who really were behind the idea and threw in their expertise, whether it was hardware engineering or design, user research, plastics manufacture. The whole lot is represented in the picture you see there. But I also hope that in sharing with you this journey and process that we've gone through, I've touched on a whole range of issues that I hope will open up a good discussion about how we go back to those very first 3 questions, like how do I get to that impactful challenge? How do I go through that design process? And how do I go from that advanced research prototype to an impact on society through production or some other means? And with that, I will turn the floor over to questions, discussions, and whatever you have to say.
Thank you so much, Cecily, for a really fascinating talk. So at this point, I just ask everyone who has questions, you can either type your question into the chat, or you can turn on your camera or raise your hand to ask your question yourself. So I'll give you a moment to think about those. I have one question in the chat from Priscilla. Would you like to read that, Priscilla, yourself? Or would you like me to read it?
Sure, I can read it.
Okay.
Thanks for the great talk, Cecily. I'm super interested in inclusive technologies that children with mixed abilities can use collaboratively to like play and learn together. And when you mentioned using like existing technologies for prototyping, I was wondering if you had any thoughts about involving technologies like AI and voice interfaces for playful learning experiences, because that's kind of like the new and cool stuff now. And how would you go about designing a workshop to explore that with children, especially when like disability awareness isn't always like part of school curriculum? So like maybe the children like don't necessarily like want to, like they might have different preconceptions when they're working together with children that have these differences.
Sure. Just before that, I don't know what your general norms are, but I would love for as many people who are happy to turn their cameras on to do that, because I feel very far away from a group of people I don't know, and this will just help me connect with you guys.
I second that, Cecily. Yes. Turn on your cameras if you feel like you can.
So Priscilla, to your question, well, there are a lot of questions in there, so let me try and answer at least one of them. I might challenge you just in thinking about, voice and things are the latest and greatest. And I know in research often we need to be in the latest and greatest to publish, but I hope I've convinced you at least a little bit that getting the problem right is really key, and the technologies come second. And I think you don't have to worry that it's not going to be innovative, because if you're solving a real problem where there's no solution out there, your solution will most definitely be innovative. So I might challenge you a little bit to rethink that and think about, well, what is it that I really want to achieve? Like, is it that I want to achieve? You mentioned a couple of things, like I would separate them out. One is just the interaction between children with different abilities in a setting. He didn't say whether it's a mainstream setting or a community setting. I think those differences are really important. Or is it that you're trying to bring an equitable experience? So you're trying to compensate from what's often an inequitable experience. And then that to me would then bring me on a different mental journey as to what are the kinds of things that you're going to path that you might want to do. I don't know if that entirely answers your question. I'm happy to have another go if you have more to add.
Okay, thanks Priscilla for that question. I see Henry has his hand up, so go ahead, Henry.
Hi, Cecily. Thanks for the presentation. This might be a question that's maybe hard to or challenging to answer with no real pretext thought on it, but I just want to get your thoughts on this, which is, do you think that for us to move, like, what are your thoughts? Actually, I don't want to frame it like that. What are your thoughts on our current education environments and curriculum, and the ability to bring in something that, like what you built over there? Like, what do you foresee, or is it even, do you even see it as a possibility based on what we're, like, how our whole education is framed right now from primary, let's just say from elementary school just in that environment right now? Like, is there challenges or anything like that? Or do you think it could be integrated smoothly if we do some breakthrough with accessibility technology and whatnot?
Let me try and repeat that question to make sure I've understood it. So your question is, in the educational context, and I don't know if you're talking about the US or Canada or some other place in the world, is there scope to bring in accessibility technologies into the educational curriculum? Is that the question?
Without going in, like, would there be any disruption from the way it's built up right now to like the way the grading system works?
Technology or just disruption to the educational practices?
To the educational practices.
Okay, that's a very big question. So let's take a part of that. Well, maybe just reflecting on this example, one of the reasons that I think we were able to be so successful in that sort of understanding the ecosystem as we were going on it is that coding was coming in and wasn't really well established in the school systems yet. So there was a lot more flexibility to bring things in. It was in the UK at the time, one of the ways that we were able to force it through or insist that it happen was that the UK had mandated computer science education from the age of 7 for all children. And so we said, right, well, if you've mandated computer science education, you have to make it accessible by law. So what are you going to do about it? So we had a hook right there. I think looking for those hooks can be really important if you're actually going to get to something, because particularly, well, we felt it now, even with some of the work we've done for People Lens is another AI-based system that we've got, works really well for kids, some amazing results. But post-COVID, we just can't get them into schools. Like, schools are just falling to bits in the UK. And so in that regard, we didn't have, we created a great technology, but we didn't have a hook. And that in that way, we haven't been as successful in getting it to market, even though it's in the same level of advanced state, same level of strong evaluation as CodeJumper was. But without that hook, we couldn't go further. We think we might have found that hook, but it's been a long time coming. It wasn't immediately there. So I think being aware and looking for those hooks is really important. If you do want to disrupt the education system, which I can understand why you might want to do that, again, it's looking into those hooks. Where's the first place that you're going to be able to make that happen? And what's the size of the market? And does that size of the market meet the kind of technology you can build? Like with hardware, small markets, even at its best, are really hard to work with. Where some other technologies, you can go into that small environment and you can maintain them and support them, and that's fine. So I think the connection is looking at the whole system. I think you could do it, but you got to get those things right, and they need a lot more thinking than we often put into them as a design process, because we see our job as designing technology, like I've done it, right? But I think arguing to you is that that's not enough if you really want to impact society.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions? Myra. I'll get you, if you have a question, please raise your hand and I will put you in the queue.
Hi.
Hey, Myra.
Thank you for such a nice presentation. I have a question for you. I am interested in running workshops with youth people in Latin America. And what I would like to know is how to build, or one of my concerns is how to build participants' relationship for authentic and genuine teamwork. I asking you this because I could see through your videos that participants were working together. And I am wondering if you just randomly selected the teams, or do you take the time to find the best matches, or how you did it?
Yeah, sure. So my understanding of the question is you're moving into the Latin America context, you're running design workshops, and how do you build that relationship with people? Well, I can certainly share how I do it. It's not always very transferable, I'm afraid. I think, again, this is one of the point where I realized, because we are part of the blind community, I can phone up one of 30, 40, 50 parents and say, hey, do you want to come to Microsoft Research? And they go, yeah, well, how about next week? Sure. So it's very easy for me in this regard, which, you know, most people don't have that access. But that's why I say, if you have a community that you're connected to, you have a very powerful thing that you're sitting on that you may not realize. But beyond that, we actually spent a lot of time thinking very carefully about how we position ourselves with the children. And I can think of the latest technology we just finished called Find My Things. We brought in a young a citizen design team. So these were people ages 14 to 30, and we brought them in as co-designers. Now, co-design is nothing unusual to our field, but what was perhaps very thought through was how we engaged with their what their role was. So we said their role was not just to help us create a design, but their role was to learn to be designers. So back to that initial thought of co-jumper, we want to start skilling up this group of people to create their own futures. And so when we did those workshops, I remember the designer who was planning them, she had like one column, what did we need out of this workshop? And this other column of like, what are they getting out of this workshop? And really spending a lot of time balancing what are they learning and what are we learning? And down to the language that we use, down to how we set up activities. And even when we did things like, we had them do A/B testing. And obviously it was convenient for one of them to be the test subject because they were all blind and low vision people. But we always had one of them be the researcher, and then they would swap. So they always had the role, they always had a role which wasn't just a user role. And we gave them a lot of vocabulary, a lot of structure to sort of put in their hooks in their mind, these skills that if they ever wanted to take on this profession, they would have heard about these things, they would have experienced them, and they would know whether they liked them. So we spent a lot of time in every one of our projects. Those relationships have been built differently, but they've been built on that sense of how do we get equity and how do we give to a community. I can see particularly in the blind community, when we engage with people just for money, it's just for money, and the rates that we need to pay people keep going up, 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 up. But when we engage with them on like, we're going to help you skill for your future, we're going to help you have an experience that you could have never had before, that's far more valuable to them than giving them money.
Okay, thank you.
I'm raising my hand with a question. Now I will lower my hand. Cecily, thank you so much for your talk. I really appreciated the way you shared with us and framed your own experience with your son and your family, and how that gave you these insights through your own experience about some of the ways of approaching this work. And I also really appreciated how you were showing us and describing some of the participatory kind of community directed and oriented work that allowed you to move through different phases of the design and the development of the prototype. And I couldn't help think about the tension that there seems to be, and probably always will be, between trying to do like long, sort of deep time scale participatory iterative development of a prototype in relation to the drive to bring something to market, right? And the limited amount of time and resources that might be allowed or directed towards that kind of a project. And I was wondering if you would speak more to your experience of that, the sort of tension around and barriers to doing really good participatory work that brings the necessary insight in order to make truly successful technologies for people to use.
It is a tension. And again, I don't feel I have a completely good answer, because again, this is where I've relied really heavily on spending half of my life in this community and learning to not beat myself up because I've missed a day of work because of XYZ blindness issue, which there are endless of them. But I rather see it as this is part of me being great at what I do. So that's not maybe a solution for everybody, but it's one that's worked for me, and one reason where I haven't given up, and my manager hasn't given up on me, and actually I can bring these two things together in a really valuable way that would be hard to do otherwise. I think and it's funny when we watch people come into our teams, and it can take a good year and a half before people are really in the same mindset as the rest of the team around a lot of the subtleties about how we engage with this community. It can really take a long time. But once that's there, once there's some kind of underlying there, and to be honest, I've started recently working with the deaf community, which sort of made me laugh a bit, because I think the blind community, deaf community are put together all the time, but I think I don't know anything about the deaf community. I don't even know anybody who's deaf or hard of hearing. Yet we're constantly grouped together. Our services are all together. But it was almost like a new starting point of moving into a space that I didn't have this expertise in. And I found that once I had developed it one space, actually for many, there are details about how exactly each community works, but the challenges that they face as a marginalized group are actually not that different. And the challenges they face about what inclusion means, they're not that different. And so maybe you can also think of it a bit more longitudinally in one's career. You don't need to do it all in one project. Maybe it's a skill that you build up over time. I think that's hard as a student, because you think, right, I got to get my degree, I'm gonna be trained in this. But of course, we all have a whole life to live, and maybe that's the value of getting old, is at least hopefully you get some experience along with the gray hair as well. So I think there's this elements that we can build up over time. And I would just give a third part of that question. Is just that I don't think it takes a lot of contact time with people if you get the stuff, what you do with them right. And I think you could spend a long time getting what those interactions are going to look like right. And one of the things that I've asked my team all to do is I've sent them all out to be part of disability sports. They can choose their disability, I don't care. And some of them play, blind football, others play goalball, some of them play some of these cool sort of wheelchair basketball, and to use that curiosity and engagement with people all up to really grow themselves outside their work. And I find that this brings a lot of perspective when it comes to designing engagements and workshops in ways that can cut down the time that you need quite considerably.
Thank you very much. That's fascinating. Reese.
Thanks. I had a question about kind of researching the research process. I think that you mentioned when you were talking about the diversity of the blind and low vision community, that some of that diversity changed what data you were collecting, if I kind of caught that right. And so I wanted to just hear a little bit more about that. Like, how did that shift what you were thinking in terms of data collection?
Yeah, that's a great question. Could be quite a long one, but I'll try and keep it short. Let's just take a bog standard example. If your aim is to teach computer science skills, well, why aren't you testing computer science skills at the end? You said you're going to teach computer science skills, so why don't you find, and then we start to say, well, we've got 7-year-olds and 11-year-olds. That's obviously pretty different. Okay, so let's limit the study to 10 and 11-year-olds. They're the top of the bunch. Let's test them. But what about the 7-year-olds? We need to know the product works for them too. And then, okay, well, we've got kids, as I said, many have multiple disabilities. So they could be in mainstream school, they could be in special schools, they could be in home settings, they could be anywhere. And what do we do with them? I said one of the most enthusiastic teachers had a child who only built the program after 12 weeks of 3 pods long. And he was just over the moon. He said this was the most amazing thing this child had ever done. Well, how do you measure that, right? If you go by measuring success, that doesn't look very successful, does it? But if that was success for that child, then you've been successful. If the teacher feels that education has happened, then you've been successful. So then how do you measure those things? Well, you can only really get indirect measurements of those, of which we do. We look at, how many, the study was a while ago, so I'm trying to remember exactly what we measured, but there are a range of survey questions about, did the student reach the goals set by the teacher? And we got from the students, their perspectives on it. A lot of researchers criticized us. We had a lot of criticism saying, well, why don't you do video? Why don't you go out and video And then you could see whether education had happened. And I would really push back against that, because yes, this is our standard way of doing research. We might have managed to, after a lot of effort, get into schools and video kids, which if you've tried to do, it's not the easiest thing in the world, particularly in the UK. But is that really what we want? Because to know the product's successful, it's not for us to know as researchers. It's for the teachers to think it's successful, because they're the ones who are going to use it and buy it and develop it. So really what I said we want to know about is, well, how do they extend this project? What do they do with it? And as I said, one of the main things teachers did with it was to support socialization. Most of them could have cared less about code. And that's possibly because they're primary school teachers. They don't know anything about code, but they know a lot about supporting kids. You know, that's their job, right? So maybe that's just how they used it. Or maybe that's what was the biggest need. I mean, my perspective on the blind community is that is by far the biggest need among blind kids is their complete isolation from other kids. And so it's really hard to know what to measure, and it's really hard to not want to knock out the success of all those children, despite the fact it might not look the same. We've also seen a lot of people saying, well, why don't you just go to the special schools? Like, why bother with homeschool kids? Well, 10% of blind kids are homeschooled. That's why bother with them, you know, because that is the community. Like, everyone should have access in that community. It shouldn't be our research needs that drive it. We should be able to be creative researchers to be able to assess goodness. You know, we shouldn't just need to follow a formula. We should have ways of doing that. But we need to address their needs as a community first. And I just maybe finish with a story which has very much shaped my perspective, which is, so when my child was less than a year, we signed up to a national-wide study, Great Ormond Street, which is our biggest tertiary hospital. So it's like the place for blind kids, apparently, or at the time, that's what we were told. And they ran this study, and they showed up at 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, a year. And you know, by the last one at a year, just a year old, my son was like, I'm not doing this. And he put his hands behind his back and he would sit there. And he had picked up very quickly that they were norming him against something that he couldn't do or couldn't be. He was only a year. And it was incredibly powerful for me to watch how negatively impactful their research methods were on my own child. And I was thinking, and what did they learn? And I kept saying, who's going to use this information? Why do you care whether he performs like a sighted child? We know he's not a sighted child. He hasn't got any eyes. He's definitely not going to see. So, you know, why do you care about that? But from the psychology literature, that's what they do. They're like, well, we need a baseline. So we compare them against this baseline because that's what we have. And it just struck me as such a banal conversation that they were in their thought and hope of doing good, you know, desperately impacting children. We have never, ever participated in research since then, ever. And I'm a researcher, right? So I know what's going on. I should be involved. And I'm like, nope, the chance of it impacting my own child negatively is just too great a chance for me to take than it is for me to give back to the research community. So that's the other thing that's really impacted me, is that our measures should never have a negative impact on the people we work with. And so often we just think about what we're supposed to do and not on the impact that that's having on the people that we're working with. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thanks. I also think a lot about like what success looks like in community-based projects. And so this is definitely a different community than any I've worked with. So it's interesting to hear how similar that can be.
Great.
I just want to say what you're saying also resonates with different work that I'm involved in. I was thinking of a scholar in Canada named Eve Tuck, who is Indigenous and who's written about what she calls desire-based research over damage-based research. When outside researchers are working with Indigenous communities, the sort of history and convention has been to focus on damage and documenting it and exploring it, as opposed to focusing on desires of communities and what they would like to see out of research. And so I feel like there's an interesting connection there, and thinking about what research can do and should do that way.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Are Are there other questions for Cecily as we come towards, we still have some time, but I think this has been a very interesting conversation, and really appreciate all of your answers to the questions, Cecily. Arshia.
Cecily, thank you very much. It's so moving to see that you work towards what you personally deeply connect to. And I'm looking for general advice. I'm still taken by your last slide and the general advice you have. So you mentioned something about that this was a side project in Microsoft, but you somehow managed to situate this project with Microsoft, an organization that you essentially need to align your work somehow with the agenda of the organization. And you also mentioned the legislation that was a hook for you, that probably facilitated certain processes to justify the importance of the project. What sort of advice you have for researchers who have the same passion or think they can contribute to a field with lived experience that it's hard for other people from outside or without the lived experience to contribute in the same level, but not essentially can find that alignment with the agenda of the institution or the government or the context they're living in?
So let me try and repeat the question. So the question is, how do you use one's own lived experience to create great things when there isn't that alignment with what an institution will support or what a government will support? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, somehow how not to give up.
How not to give up. Oh, well, this project was definitely a training ground in how not to give up. I think it's again again to keep in your mind this larger ecosystem. So if there isn't institutional support, there isn't government support, who is supporting it? Like, are there other members of the community engaged? Are there so who because anything that's going to be impactful, somebody's going to be supporting, right? They might not be the people with money, but somebody's going to be engaged in it. And the question is, how can you use that in different ways to move forward bit by bit? And I guess it really depends on the technologies. I mean, hardware is a very different thing than software, because software is a little easier to move bit by bit, whereas hardware is like, you do it or you don't. And if you haven't got 100,000 pounds, you ain't making a manufacturing line, no matter how cheap you can do it, right? There are just some real structures that you have to abide by. So I guess it's quite difficult to answer in the abstract, but I think there are hooks everywhere, and I think the most likely way of finding them is to kind of look towards the people who are engaged and start to be thinking about where is their power for themselves coming from, and how can you hook into that, and are there smaller versions? And I think one thing that was nice about this project, but one tension I think many people found, is that when you have to hit two birds with one stone, you need to hit what's going to work for them, and you have to hit some novelty contribution with the technology or something like that. That can make it very hard to move forward. So I think knowing your priorities is also really important. Like, sometimes the best technology isn't novel. It's because it's the best technology for what's there, and thinking about how to engage with that if you have other agendas as well. And I think the clearer you are in your own thinking, or one isn't clear by sitting down and being clear, right? But the clearer you are and being clear in those questions and reconsidering them through every step you make, I think the easier it is to find that path. I personally am trying very hard to focus on, as I look forward, like if I just look across about having created Code Jumper, People Lens, Find My Things, they've all had different routes to market. I personally am focusing on mainstream technologies and getting those right. Because one thing that I've really struggled with, we created some great experiences, they're incredibly needed, but I still get from the community like, Cecily, that's great. But you know what? I still can't access Microsoft Word. And you're like, I know it's not my job to fix Microsoft Word, but actually I'm starting to think it is my job to fix Microsoft Word, because, you know, in some ways, this is the most basic part of people's lives. And as much as they might like interesting and novel things, if they can't do the basic things in their lives, the rest of it doesn't really matter. We've also struggled a lot with the education system. Like, I would love to do a lot more work around tools for people doing maths and moving, because the stuff that's out there, some of it's good, hard to get hold of, really expensive. But so few children get through the education system enough to get to those places that it's really hard to design from. It's not because they couldn't do it if we had a decent education system that doesn't weed them out along the way, but they don't. And the reality is, trying to design and manufacture something for a population that's so small is going to be very unlikely to be successful. So although that's very meaningful to me, there are a lot of things that are meaningful in the world. Like, fortunately or unfortunately, I don't know, we have a lot of problems to solve. So we don't have to just focus in on one. We can think, okay, maybe there's a different one. And again, that, I think for me, it's that constant reflective experience of like, what's the right thing right now? And for me, the right thing right now is to try and fix screen readers, Word, these things that actually, it's not very exciting to fix them. But I think if I really want to have impact, that's where it needs to be, because that's the thing that I see as blocking people from having gainful employment and lives.
Thank you.
I think there was one question in the chat. I'm happy to answer that if you like, or unless we need to finish.
Oh, no, absolutely. That's from Angela. Angela, would you like to read your question, or I can, oh, she lost her voice. Okay, you want me to read it, Cecily? Angela says, I have a question about the ecosystem you mentioned at the end, where good technologies are created but not commercialized successfully. How do you think the ecosystem should improve to bring these technologies to the community? Also, I know Microsoft does inclusive accessories and wonder if that was an option in bringing this project to mainstream classrooms.
Yeah, good two questions there. Yeah, I would love somebody to solve this problem. I don't know if there are any people who are business savvy on this call, but I think the biggest blocker is sorting out this gulf, a remaining gulf between the people who supply accessibility technologies and or healthcare technology. So things that are sold to governments and healthcare providers, because the cost, is just exorbitant. So a Braille display, for example, is £5,000. Like, I know hardware is expensive, but £5,000, come on. And there've been efforts to try and bring that cost down. They're very like the Orbit projects, and they always fail. And I think we in thinking about where a lot of these things could be mainstreamed, Braille displays maybe not, but there are a lot of these technologies that we could start to be thinking more about, inclusive technologies that could be mainstreamed or could have a wider audience. And to me, this is an important, if we can move that gap, I think we'll be much more, the ability to maintain these products on market is going to be much more likely, because even if you can get them there, the harder challenge is to maintain them. And people have become reliant on these, they're dependent on them. You can't just pull them from the market, but as we will have seen Microsoft do a couple of months ago, they can do, and they do, and then people's lives go in complete chaos. So I think, but we know mainstream products will be maintained. We know they'll be updated. We know they'll be constantly improved. We know there's heavy investment in them. So it's a much easier route. So I think the more we can bring those markets together, the better. I think there's been some interesting companies. There's things like X-Ray Vision, which is working on smart glasses for the deaf community. They've got a great business model on how to make the stuff they're doing mainstream as well. And I think a lot more companies like that will start to dramatically bring down the costs of some of these things. So smart glasses, for example, are on the market now in the last year and a half. For some of them you can get for $350, $500, even some really good ones like the Nreals. And if you want to buy a pair of not so great smart glasses for the accessibility market, it's £3,000. So the difference in cost is just astronomical, and you have to keep asking yourself, like, why? There's no difference in those technologies, so why is the cost so different? And I think, again, it's because people know that governments are going to pay for things. They know that health providers are going to pay for things. And as a result, it's a sure market. So the business investors will put their money behind it. And as a result, they have a different sales. They go out and they sell to people. Like when we got our Braille display, they're like, we're going to come and demonstrate this Braille display to me. And I said, you are definitely not coming to my house, because that's what makes your Braille display so expensive. You stay where you are and get on a phone call with me and show me how to use it. I'm sure I can manage, right? But it's their sales model. And they don't even go to the users. Most of the time they go to the local authorities and the teachers of the blind and things like that. So I think there's something really broken about these sales models, and they're being perpetuated by government and healthcare support systems. And we need to break that, because the power is taken away from the blind people to get what they need and put in the hands of someone who decides whether they are liable or eligible to have those things or not. And again, another thing, my son uses a speech computer. Took 9 months, a key technology, that's something that we use pretty much every 5 minutes, every day, took 9 months to get, right? That really takes the power from the user to get what they really, really need. Because again, I didn't really want to shell out £3,000 for a speech computer when I knew they would pay for it if I just waited long enough. So we actually built a Bluetooth keyboard and computer and stuff like that in the meantime. So there's a lot of things where actually we've taken the power out of people's hands. And as a result, the cost goes up. People don't get what they need. So I think this is the ecosystem that I see needs to, certainly within the blind community, absolutely needs to change. And a lot of these providers don't even have the skills to do AI technologies. Like I wouldn't trust them. Like this was like the most complex hardware APH had ever seen in their lives. And we saw some pretty, this is on recording, so I won't give some more detailed stories, but some things where it's like, oh, okay, wait, you've never done this before. And if we move on to more complex technologies, like the NGO groups are just not prepared. The community itself are not prepared to support these technologies. So we get stuck there as well. So that's that. Your second question, Microsoft does do inclusive accessories for Surface. This is a fairly detailed question. They bring out things that are easy to scale, that are very, very low cost. CodeJumper is not easy to scale, it's not low cost. So it didn't fit within sort of a Microsoft framing. And Microsoft doesn't sell to people, and they wouldn't have the right networks to sell to people. And also what APH has done really, really well is really go out and get teachers on board, get everybody, libraries, teachers. I mean, they've just hit the US by storm, and they've done really well. You know, you're not going to get that through Microsoft. That's not their job. That's not what they know how to do.
Thank you. Angela says that makes sense. I think you just painted a really also incredible picture of the complex ecology of these technologies and how much they seem to depend on the success or are subject to the failures of the broader structures that they have to work within. And that's very interesting to hear. So we're coming to the end of this presentation. I'm not seeing any more hands being raised or questions. So I think, Cecily, it's probably getting late where you are. And we really appreciate you taking the time across the time zone to join us and share your really important and inspiring work with us. So I hope everyone will join me and Reese and Priscilla in thanking Cecily for your talk today. You're going to get lots of mimed applause. Little hands. Yeah.
Well, my pleasure, and I wish everybody a great journey onto finding the ways that they can impact the world. Everybody has their own journey, and everybody's journey is an important one.
Thank you so much. Thanks to everyone for joining us. We will see you next week in person back on campus. Thanks so much for joining us today.